Well, welcome back to another edition and episode of Further Upstream with Shane Morris. But Shane Morris is not here because he has a baby at home. And Jennifer England here is the producer and product manager for the Strong Women team and has been working on a number of different avenues here at the Colson Center. And I've asked her to come on to fill in for Shane. So Jennifer, you are the new and I would say improved, but I know that Shane's going to listen to this, so I don't think I can say new and improved Shane. But
we can't do competition.
No, but everything's a competition for me. I don't know if you have this in your family, but I tell all my kids that they're my favorite when I need them to be my favorite. Like, hey, could you get me a glass of water? Oh, you're my favorite kid. I always do that. That's probably really bad parenting.
It might be a big family thing because I'm the oldest of 6, and we're all super competitive. So
yeah,
the more kids you have, the more of a competition it is.
Yeah, so my kids will definitely be those ones that are pushing kids down the slide, like it's my turn. But we'll pray a lot more for them. But today, I want to talk to you about Shane's conversation that he had with Max McLean. And you have quite an extensive experience and background in drama and production. And so I'm excited to dive into this and actually go, I would say, upstream on a lot of these topics that Shane and Max didn't really get to in terms of they really explored C.S. Lewis's conversion. But Max operates this, I don't know if you'd call it like a theater house out of New York City, but they travel around the United States and they do plays based on, a lot of them based on C.S. Lewis novels. So The Great Divorce and Screw Tape Letters and a number of other C.S. Lewis plays, but then they've also done a few with Martin Luther and kind of the anniversary of the 95 Theses. They did a production on that. And I've been to probably 4 or 5. And I think that they're the best thing, maybe this side of heaven. They're incredible. We sat in the front row and saw one once. And I just thought it was incredible watching The Great Divorce acted out. It changed my life, changed my perspective on a lot of things. But why do you think that when we see these dramatizations, especially of books that maybe we've read, why do you think that it has and carries so much weight for us? Why is it important for Christians to think about?
Well, if you look back at the story that God tells us in the Bible, it's set as a drama. I mean, we have people who sing praises to God, who dance for God's glory. We have people who are writing poetry to God. And we've lost a lot of that in our modern culture. We've lost that feeling of being part of this great story and part of the drama that we are all part of. And I think when we go see a movie or we go see a play, it reminds us of that greater story that we're all a part of. And when we see that, we kind of feel that longing, or at least I do. When I sit in a theater and you're waiting for that curtain to rise and you hear the music just getting ready to play and you just feel that anticipation, that excitement, it almost speaks to that longing that we all have for something bigger or something more glorious, something that's always that hunger that we're looking for. And when we see that in play form, we take part of it in some way. So theater is my background. So theater to me is probably a little bit more encompassing than a movie, but both are equally helpful, I think, in helping us see that bigger picture, being part of that story. But as you watch people on stage and they interact with each other, they're also interacting with you. And you're part of that story that they're playing. Each audience changes the play a little bit. There's a reason that actors will be backstage looking out to say, how's the audience? What are they like? Because how the audience is and how they interact with the actors, it changes the feel of the play. It changes the energy in the room. And so that participation that the audience gets just gives us that tiny glimpse of what it means to be part of that larger story, what it means to be part of God's story. And that is an excitement that you can't really replicate in a lot of other ways.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting that you use that phrase, kind of part of God's story, because I think for me, at least, my devotion time is, understanding a little bit of the reality, the history of what happened to Israel and whatever situation that they're in, right? And then trying to work to apply that to my life. And I don't ever really think about, I would say, before starting to work at the Colson Center, it wasn't a thought in my mind to think about this moment in history as part of a story. So help me understand that a little bit. Why is it important, and what difference does it make to actually see this moment in history as a part of a story that God is maybe carrying out or playing out in front of us right now? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that's one of the things that makes Christianity so beautiful and also so unique, in that it's not a story of some distant God that we're trying to get to know. It's a story of God that we are part of. And I mean, Colson Center talks a lot about the story of creation, fall, redemption, restoration, and how we are part of that story. And that's really what makes the Christian life so beautiful and so appealing. It's not just something an ancient God did long time ago, but it's something that an active God is doing in our lives today. And as we get a glimpse of that, I think it really makes sense to those of us who have that longing for more, or that feeling that C.S. Lewis talks of, that beyond the veil, that we know that there's something more, and we know that what we have right in front of us is not it. So what is that? And so when we realize we're part of that greater story, it fills that need, and we realize that's what I've been looking for. That's what I've been missing. And so we've, as Christians, especially in our modern culture, we've taken that beautiful first chapter gospel and boiled it down to the very bare basics of fall and redemption. And there's just so much more to the Christian story. And when we see that and we get to interact with that, I think that's when we really get to see the fullness of what Christianity is and the fullness of what God has called us into.
So at the beginning of Max McLean's film that he was talking about with Shane, The Most Reluctant Convert, which is basically a story about C.S. Lewis. And I've read a lot of biographies about Lewis. And it's been interesting to kind of I felt like I had a lot of knowledge about Lewis's history, but to see it dramatized, it changed even like the mental image that I think I had in my head of Lewis, working things out, or, the different walks that he would have, and the engagement that he had with the Inklings and processing all of that. Like, seeing it dramatized, it totally changed it. And there's specifically one scene at the beginning of the film, and if you haven't seen it, I'd encourage you to go find it. I think it's on YouTube, and we'll put it in the show notes, a link to it in the show notes. But the inside of the opening scene, Max is kind of in a dressing room, and it's almost like we're getting a behind the scenes look at the before the film, and then they say kind of like action, and then all of a sudden he snaps into this C.S. Lewis character, and he starts quoting all of these things from like the canon of Lewis. I mean, he pulls things out of books that and pieces it together in just a beautiful, masterful way. But I thought it was really interesting that that's how they started the movie, or they started the film. That's how they dramatized this play, or this presentation of The Most Reluctant Convert, is that Max is in a dressing room getting his makeup done and all of that. Help me understand a little bit, maybe from your standpoint, what's the significance of that with your drama background? Why do we care about that? And why is it important maybe for us, on this wall? That's like they call it the fourth wall, right? Am I understanding that right? That you've got the three walls, and then you break kind of the fourth wall when you let the audience in a little bit, as I'm understanding that. Why is that such a powerful thing? And why do you think that's an important thing for us even to have inside of this film? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I actually have the advantage of, I heard Max answer this question at Wilberforce Weekend. So after they showed his movie, there was just a quick question and answer time with John Stone Street afterwards. And he asked this question. And what he talked about, which I thought was really interesting, was that this was an idea that came, I believe, from the director of the movie. And the reason he chose this was because Christian films historically have taken themselves too seriously and have gone too far into being really, really earnest. And so he wanted to do something opposite of that. And so his take on that was to kind of bring you along the journey of going from the green room into the story and then back out of the green room, to kind of almost have that kind of tongue-in-cheek look at it. And I thought that was really interesting from a theater stage standpoint. So in a theater, you hang out in the green room all the time. That's where you form a lot of your relationships. That's where a lot of the energy actually comes from. You're feeding off, your friends, your fellow actors, the stage crew. And so it's a very different place than what people see on stage. You get to see kind of the aftermath of all the energy that goes on stage and kind of either see it come down or see people ramping up to go there. And so I found that a really interesting choice because it is such a different space and it's a space that the audience rarely participates in. And in fact, if you're not involved in theater, you probably don't even think about what's happening back there in the green room because you're so immersed in the story on the stage. But there's a whole nother story happening backstage. And there's been different plays that have been written about that kind of backstage story. And they're always fascinating because there is a lot of fun things that happen. There's a lot of energy. There's also a lot of drama. I mean, you get a bunch of actors back there. There can be a lot of extra drama as well. But that is actually a really interesting thing that I thought he included in that was letting the audience kind of see a little bit of what is it like to make a movie? What is it like to be backstage? What is it like before you say rolling? What does it say after, what is it like after you say cut? How does that look? So in just those few moments, you almost kind of get a glimpse of that behind the scenes peek.
Mm-hmm. That's so interesting because you probably never have this because I think that you're a lot more put together than our family is. But we have this moment. I was kind of telling somebody the other day, when we go to church, we have a ginormous van. We have 8 kids, but they're all giants like me. They're all like 6'8". So we like shuffle them into the van, and there's a significant to moderately significant amount of like loud talking and direction that's given in the van, which might be equated to yelling. Some people might feel like that. I don't know. But there's always this like, oh, there's so much tension. And then you get out of the van and it's like, okay, now we're entering the stage, right? And we kind of like walk out. And we're like, now we're going to church. Okay. So everyone like be on your, and I wonder a little bit about that as you're talking about this kind of behind the scenes, because I think that there's a reality for us that when we look at God's story, we see it from that timeline of seeing it as if the play has been carried out on the stage, right? But there's a reality, I think, inside of each of us that there's this wrestling out that kind of goes on maybe in our hearts. There's like the green room of our hearts that, as maybe if somebody for like a John Stone Street, when they're doing a breakpoint script or whatever, you see the finished product, but you don't see the wrestling out inside of the editor's room or even internally inside of the writer's heart. That's we're wrestling through. What should we say? What's an important thing here? Do I really believe that? Let me back up that belief. And I think the play in kind of the green room is an interesting analogy a little bit to that when we look at God's story, oftentimes we see the big, amazing things. We see David and his mighty men, but we don't really like pull the David and his mighty men a lot of time back to like the Psalms when David's just cowering in the crags of the rock, right? So maybe give me a picture on what are your thoughts there then with how important is it for Christians, as Max explained it kind of inside of The Most Reluctant Convert, to start the movie in the green room. How important is it also for that to be something that maybe we reflect as believers as we're kind of, quote unquote, living out this story in God's timeline? But there's also like internal wrestling. There's the Stender family in their van, like, you guys, we got to no, put your shoes on. You guys have mismatching socks. Oh my goodness, turn around. Like that, all of that is real life things that happened last week. But when we walk into that, I think that there's also maybe a little bit like Max is saying that as Christians, we need to pull back the curtain a little bit and be more authentic. And I'm wondering, is that really a thing that we should consider? Having been somebody that's kind of on the stage, is the green room an important like dynamic and aspect that we should consider even like in attending a play or in attending a performance, but also inside of our Christian life? Do we bring the green room out? Is that an important thing, or what happens in the green room that we should consider there? What are your thoughts there with that?
Well, first, what parent does not feel that way on Sunday mornings? Like there's just something about Sunday mornings and getting to church that you're like, did my kids forget all humanity? What happened over here?
And then you get this comment like, oh, you put your daughter's hair in a ponytail. And I look at my wife like, I did that. And it's like, I just got a standing ovation. Like, this is amazing. The world recognized that I can do that. But yeah, totally. I think that's all parents. Fair enough. You're right.
That's true. Well, I think that's a really interesting question when you talk about green room with the theater and just how that relates to the Christian life. I think one of the things with theater in particular is that you mostly think about the actors, you mostly think about the people that are in front of you on stage, as you should. But theater itself is put on by so many different people. And the people on stage could not be there without the support of many more people that you never see or never hear or never know about. But the actors interact with those people quite frequently. And you'll hear a lot about, different celebrities that will be known for either being a great person to work with or not being a great person to work with, because you will see who they really are when they're not performing, when they're not on stage. And so you really can see in the green room or in the backstage or on a movie set, any of these times that you're interacting with people, that they can be completely different than the persona that they put off when they're acting or when they're putting on this. And then some people are not. Some people are really genuine. The people who are really genuine are usually the people that are most well liked or most well known for that. Like, they become well known and people want to work with them because of that. And so when you look at a theater and you look at a theater company, obviously there's all types of different theater companies, and some are more functional than others backstage. And so when you're interacting with people in different environments, and especially in theater, it brings together a lot of different personalities and different types of people. You can really see who people really are in that backstage. And so I think it is a good analogy when you look at the Christian life, because how do you really know somebody when you go out to dinner with someone and how they treat the waitress? That's when you really know, oh, okay, that's who that person is, when they're interacting with somebody that they may not see again. And those are kind of those little moments that you see people and you go, okay, so I now get a glimpse of what's behind that curtain, because you can't hide who you really are all the time. And so you'll see that come out in people. And I think you see that theater just amplifies things, because most people that do theater are kind of dramatic. So we all come to it because we're like, we like the drama, we like the energy, we like all these things that feed into what makes theater really great. And so you'll get to see, because you have all this pressure put on these people, you'll see what really comes out. And so you do get to kind of see a little bit of who people really are behind the stage, and you get to know people, and they're not always the person that you see in the front of the stage. And that could be good or bad. Sometimes you have people playing villains who are just the sweetest people ever in real life, and vice versa. So a lot of it is that you get to know people really well when you're in theater. It's almost like, when you have kids and you're just overwhelmed with life in those beginning stages.
I have no idea what you're talking about.
I'm sure you don't. You don't have enough kids yet. You need some more. But one of my mentors likened it to, you are a tube of toothpaste that's being squeezed out, and whatever's in that tube is going to come out, and you'll get to really know who you are in those moments. And you can see that in theater as well, because you do have this pressure of the show must go on. Mm-hmm. It doesn't matter what's happening behind the scenes. I've had sets break in the middle of a show, and people are trying to figure out like how to get it off and get somebody on. I've had my costume fall apart on stage, so I'm trying to hold things together and interact. And I mean, there's all sorts of things that happen. And so you have all this pressure coming at you. So you're getting squeezed. And so really you start to see whatever comes out. So you're going to start seeing that pressure play out in real life, and you start to really get to know who people are. And I think the same is true in the Christian life. I worked in ministry a really long time, and you get to really see who people are, because working in ministry can be really stressful, and you can have a lot of different issues that you deal with. You have a lot of different stressors that you deal with, and you start to get to see who you really are in those moments. And God usually uses those moments to kind of pinpoint, oh, look, that was something that you needed to work on, or I didn't know I had a problem with that until I got into that stressful situation. So theater is just an amplification of real life in a lot of ways. You can kind of see who you really are, but almost in a more dramatic fashion because you're being pushed into a place where all these emotions are coming out, or all these different things are interacting with other people who have a lot of emotions coming out. So you get to kind of see yourself in a little bit different light. And I think it's a good thing. I think you get to be really authentic and kind of pull back that curtain a little bit.
Mm-hmm. I think it's interesting thinking about the different type of personality and excitement and, different actors. We just saw the whole, I don't know if you saw, but I totally fell into the deep, dark pit of the Amber Heard, Johnny Depp, thing. Cause I felt like this is like, we're watching acting happen right here. And it's comical, but it's also like heartbreaking because you're seeing like these arguments or whatever, like all these things come out. It just was challenging. And I mean, then there's other people, like I had the chance to meet Robin Williams on the streets of New York City. I remember walking and just almost bumping into him. And just the reality of like the I don't want to say like challenged but like Robin Williams had some really sad times in his life, and he was very open about that. He talked about that. And I don't know if there's like an anatomy of a functioning person inside of drama or theater, because I think you're always, you're playing the part. And so you end up taking on emotions or conjuring up emotions for a part that maybe you didn't necessarily have. But what I think is super interesting is Max McLean's ministry inside of the Fellowship of the Performing Arts. We saw the Screw Tape Letters, and afterwards he did a Q&A with, I believe it was with Screw Tape. And somebody in the audience asked if it was challenging to play a demon. And the actor said, well, I'm not a Christian. So for me, it wasn't really like that much of a challenge because I don't believe that this is real. But he said, but when I was reading through C.S. Lewis, and I'm totally going to paraphrase it here, he said something to the effect of like, I came to an understanding of why people believe this. And I thought that was really kind of insightful, really interesting. And I don't know if that's like, and if I did a play on Buddhism, I would come to an understanding of why people believe in Buddhism. I don't know if that's where he was at, where he's just kind of an inquisitor and really just exploring the part. But what do you think that like a ministry like Fellowship of the Performing Arts can do inside of this space? Because I think oftentimes when we look at drama or performance arts, we think of it really as a liberal medium. And it's really hard to do C.S. Lewis or to do like Martin Luther. I mean, you can do it in a liberal perspective, right? But the way that they're doing it is incredibly well thought through, theologically oriented. They bring in different people to work with the writing team to make sure that all of this is actually true, not just to the theology, but to biblical authenticity and historicity inside of it. So help me understand that. Why is it that we look at performing arts kind of as a liberal medium? And then is there a resurgence that you're seeing inside of Christians coming in, people that have faith-based coming in and actually doing performance arts, like not cheesy, right? Like not we kind of like we come to this thing and we just kind of, it falls out and we think that you should like it because it's Christian, right? But is there some authenticity there that this is actually really well done? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, so most of my theater experience has actually been in Christian performing arts. So I've worked mostly in Christian settings, and that can vary depending on which setting you're in, what that means. But I also taught and directed youth theater companies. So we worked with kids. So we worked a lot with this type of thing where, you have to talk through things like playing a role that isn't someone you would want to emulate. What does that mean? And how can you handle something like that? We also made choices to make sure that we weren't putting kids in awkward positions or putting them in playing a part that they would absorb too much, because especially when you're working with teenagers who have lots of emotional angst anyway, and then you're doing theater, which is a great outlet for it, to be honest, but then they're playing a role that maybe have negative aspects to it, they're probably more likely to absorb something like that because they are so full of different emotions. They're still learning how to deal with them in a lot of ways. And so theater can be a really healthy way to do that, but it also you need to be careful about how you do it and what you're doing. So there are times where you might decide to play a role or not play a role. I mean, I had a music director that was very clear about like what shows he would never music direct for. So for example, he would never do Camelot, which is a musical that I love, but because it has a story of adultery and he didn't feel like he could be someone that would put out that story. So there's different ways that you draw the lines and different people draw lines in different places. And some people work, as actors in secular fields, and some, like that example, some secular actors worked in Christian fields. I worked for Adventures in Odyssey. So it's a radio drama program for kids and also radio theater for Focus on the Family. And we worked with a lot of actors, and some were Christians and some were not. But that we were very, very Christian based show. And so the quality of what we did, I think, was one of the reasons that people worked with us, even if they may or may not have agreed with what we were saying or doing. But the storytelling was what was important. As long as the story was really strong, people were drawn to it and they were interested in it. And we would have situations like that where they may not agree, but they could see why, or they could understand the characters and why they would make these choices or what the difference is. And I think that's really important when you're telling stories in any medium. The story is really important. I think that's something we've lost a little bit as Christians. We've become so enamored in, well, we have to tell this really tight, concise story and it can have no problems in it because we're Christians, so there can't have any problems. Well, good stories always have problems. And so when we stop telling a good story, we stop appealing to people. I think that's where we've seen some problems and, quote unquote, different Christian mediums and different Christian storytellings. And I think there is a really big interest right now in bringing really good stories to stage and to screen, and that there are a lot of people of faith out there that care deeply about this. It makes sense that people would say something like it's a liberal medium, but I see so much of the Christian story, even in stories that aren't necessarily quote unquote Christian. And, one of the reasons I think you see something like Marvel movies that are so big and popular is because you do see that hero's journey in those stories. And you see a lot of themes, even if they're unintentional themes, that play in the Christian life or that you can feel connected to. I like to talk about Endgame because, whether you like that movie or not, at the very end of that movie, it has moments that are just so powerful as a Christian that you can just watch and identify with. And I don't want to give huge spoilers here in case people haven't seen it. And
all of our audience has seen it, so we're totally good. So. You're totally okay.
Yeah. But there's a moment where Captain America just gets completely just beat down, and he is down and he's alone and he's standing himself back up, getting ready to fight against this huge army. And he's going to lose, and he knows he's going to lose, but he's going to do it anyway. And as someone who's worked and ran ministries for a very long time, I just looked at that and I was like, I feel that so deeply in my soul. I can see that. I can see you are so tired. You feel all alone, but you know what's right. And you're going to stand for what's right. And you're going to do it anyway. Mm-hmm. And you're going to pull yourself up and you're going to do this. And then all of a sudden, he has all of these people come to be his backup. And he has all of these people step back into this fight. And you just look at that. And I mean, I'm watching this and I've got tears pouring down my face because I'm seeing myself in that. I'm seeing that moment in ministry where I thought I was all alone and I'm going to have to do this. And God was like, no, that's just you. You think you're alone. You're not. Look at what I've got. Look at the host of support that you have. All of these people. You have, the realms of, the spiritual warfare that you don't even know is here. It's here, and we are fighting, and you are not doing this on your own. And you see those in moments in movies, and they mean something deeper than even what they mean on screen. And I think that's one of the reasons it's so meaningful for Christians to take part in telling stories in this way, in this medium, because it does bring you into a deeper understanding of what you're doing as a Christian and what the walk that you're doing as a Christian, the story that you're telling. When you see someone else interact it, even if it's something different, I mean, obviously we're not living in in-game times, but you see that and you identify with it because you understand the emotions and those feelings of feeling like, oh, I've been abandoned, but I'm going to fight for good. And then to realize, oh, I'm not the only one. I am not alone. I am not the only one. And so you see those moments in different stories, even if they're not coming from a quote unquote Christian place, because God is, God's story just permeates everything. If you look closely enough, you can see a lot of beautiful pieces of God's story being told by people who don't know that they're telling that story.
Yeah.
And so that's one of the reasons I think it's so important that Christians don't walk away from these mediums, because what do you remember when you walk away from like a really good sermon? Do you remember the 3 points, or do you remember the stories that they told to illustrate those points? And so when you're getting to have those stories, those are what ingrain in you. Those are what start to change you and challenge you. And really, stories help form worldview. And I think we've really done our worldview training a disservice because we're not talking about the story. We're talking about arguments. We're talking about facts, but that's not really what permeates people's hearts and minds. That's not what changes them. And that's not what moves them to action. It's the stories that we tell that will change those things.
Yeah, that's interesting because I think inside of, like you're talking about Endgame, and like those moments are really intense when we look at different things. And I can maybe relate a little bit to the nature inside of a family. Like as I'm telling a story to my kids, there's oftentimes this like glossing over that chapter on the fall. And I think I don't know if it's because I don't want them to think like, oh, and if you fall, it'll be okay, so don't worry. Like there's a little bit of that like tension for me, even as a dad, as I'm telling stories and thinking about how my kids are hearing this, that there's a tendency for me to avoid that because I want to highlight the creation, that you have been created good. And I want to highlight the redemption, that you have a God that came down and that loves you and that knows you in a powerful way, and the restoration that he's calling us into restoring this moment, like in a beautiful way. But when we come to that, the cavern of the fall, we want to make it into kind of a ditch, right? We want to make it into something that we can cross over. And it's interesting when I read through some of the older theologians that really said, no, your sin is something that you need to deal with. And I think we've got this, culture of expressive individualism. That's the Carl Truman thing. And we're going to kind of gloss over this. But when we look at that power of the story, help me understand a little bit why understanding or addressing all 4 chapters, because I used to work in high school ministry. So for 15 years, I worked in a high school dorm. We would watch movies and then we would identify, hey, there's the creation kind of plot of the story. There's the fall plot of the story. There's the redemption. There's the restoration. We would identify that as we would watch, films that really had no biblical idea, but they all follow this redemption storyline. And then I found myself at the end always like, wait a minute, the restoration or the redemption or, the creation, we got to be conscious and kind of like address that from a biblical worldview, maybe like correct it. But I never did that with the fall. I never went in to say, that depression that person was struggling with, or that, evil person that was on the other side is just kind of evil. We shouldn't explore the fall. So maybe help me understand that a little bit from a theater perspective. You're kind of counseling these different people to play those parts, but you need them to play them with authenticity in order for the play to feel, real. So why is that such a thing, do you think, that inside of the Christian world, we have a hard time jumping into that part of the story? What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think you made a good point in the fact that we didn't used to. So that's probably a relatively newer phenomenon where we gloss over that. We're trying to, and I think that is part of our cultural worldview right now, which is we're always looking for happy. Let's all be happy. Let's all be good. And so we've kind of absorbed that, and sometimes we'll like to gloss over the struggle. But as any good writer is going to tell you, you have to have the struggle to make the redemption at the end worth it. If you don't have that cost, then you don't see the worth and the beauty later. And so if you don't have that struggle, and if you don't have that moment, I was listening to author N.D. Wilson. He was talking about how he writes his books and his heroes. And he always talks about how his heroes always have more responsibility, because anyone who has, and it's the Spider-Man thing, but but like, that's true though. Like if you have someone who's willing to kind of step out, and maybe we in our minds think, oh, well, they just know better than us, or they're better than us in some way. But really, they're just ordinary people who have taken on greater responsibility. That's what they have done. They've stepped up in some way. And there's always struggle with that. If you're going to face evil, or if you're going to fight for good, or if you're going to do anything that usually happens in that type of story, you're going to have to struggle with yourself, because there is a fall, there is a reality, there is a sin nature. And you see that play out in so many different types of stories, that there's always some sort of obstacle, and usually within yourself, that you have to overcome. That's pretty universal. That's not something that you have to get people to understand when you're talking to them, or you're coaching them, or talking with acting. And with acting, when you're talking through things like this, you're not actually telling any actor to say, I want you to try to imagine yourself in this situation. You're usually, and there's different techniques, but here's one technique you'll use, is that you'll try to do transference. So you'll think through. So like my acting coach, she played Medusa. So that's not like an easy role to like imagine yourself into necessarily. And she was talking us through how she had to try to find a place in her life where she just felt such anger, and use that to play into this role. And so that's a lot of times what you're doing. You're not necessarily even, and it's, again, different actors have different techniques, but a lot of times you're using things in your own personal life and saying, oh, I really struggled here. This is where I felt these emotions. And that's how you bring it into the character. And that can really impact how you feel about the character in a lot of ways. A lot of times, even villains, most people who play villains will tell you, oh no, I love that person because they had to dive deep into that person and find the good. Like most people who are quote unquote villains, they believe in whatever it is they're doing. There's very few just truly evil villains. And so they usually have a reason. It might not be a good reason, but you can dive into that person. And it's kind of that same like image of God thing, that we know that everybody has value because they have an image of God in them. And so actors a lot of times are trying to find that. So even in those fallen moments, they're trying to find that good, or find the why behind it, because we all sin and we justify it in some ways. Like, oh, well, it's okay that I did that because so-and-so did this. I mean, that was in the Garden of Eden. What Adam and Eve were like, oh, no, it wasn't my fault. It was their fault. It's like, that's such a human thing. And so in that fall and in that moment, trying to find the reason you're justifying it. Why are you justifying this thing? And honestly, when you, as an actor, and when you're working in a Christian setting, I think that these questions are so fascinating, because you can really talk about really deep stuff with each other, and you get to navigate through, okay, so we can see like the actions are really horrible. What's going on? What's making those actions happen? What are the justification for that? Is that a sin? Are you sinning here in this, is this character choosing to sin, and why are they choosing to? And one of the plays that just means a lot to me is Into the Woods. And part of it is because in that musical, you see so much of humanity and a lot of sin nature played out, and what are the consequences of it. And so at the beginning, every character has a wish. They have something that they want, and they want it so badly that they're willing to trade just about anything to get that wish. And how human is that? We all have something that we're like, oh, if only I had this, I would be happy. I'd be satisfied. I want this. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to get that. And then you go through the play, and the first act is basically all these fairy tales that you know, and they happen the way that you know that they happen. You know, Cinderella gets her prince. She wins in the end. You know, Little Red Riding Hood defeats the wolf. So you go through that. But in the second act, you see the consequences of them all getting their wish. And you see, oh, well, Cinderella got her prince, but actually she's not very happy because she doesn't have what she really thought she was going to get in life. And you go through this story with each of them and you find out, oh, there are consequences to these things. There's consequences to chasing after things without thought to anybody else. There's consequences to having a desire so deep that you're willing to trade everything for it. And what the really, I think, just poignant moment at the end of the show is once the characters have gone through this journey, and some of them have lost everything, they've gone through it and you see it. They have changed, but at the very end, they come back and one character says, I wish, because isn't that the human thing? You see what the consequences were, and then all of a sudden, and yet I still want what I want, and I still want something more, and I'm still going to keep trying to do something new and go for that next thing. And there's so many things like that within theater where you can just find that gold. And so my husband and I actually directed Into the Woods together with teenagers, and it was fun to dive into that because there's so much humanity in some of these plays. And again, you have to be discerning. Some have better than others, but there are moments of just really, there's truth that you can find, and you can find in that struggle and in that fall, you can see how beautiful the redemption is that comes out of that. And so if you miss that, and if you gloss over it, if you try just to pretend it away, it doesn't make it go away. It just means that our story isn't complete, and it's not as meaningful. Mm-hmm. We need the struggle to have the beauty at the end.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I think that's incredibly helpful to think through that. I do believe that there's also something that you're doing, and I'm maybe taking what I've experienced in my drama roles and different things that I've done in plays and whatever, and pushing it into this conversation. But my experience was that at a young age, we got into drama, and it developed inside of my mind an imagination of what the world can be like, or what the world could be like, or what a world inside of this script, it includes. Does it include trees, and what's the color on the floor? And like, it just kind of is this like blank canvas that I just get to explore and kind of dive into. And so in that, I want you to maybe kind of, as we kind of wrap up our time here, I want you to dive into why is it imperative, and I would use that word imperative. I want to push that on you. I want you to tell me, why is it imperative that Christians care about art, and especially performance art, especially in this cultural moment right now?
So when we look at things like scripture and we talk about what is it going to be like in heaven, and we see just the different glimpses that we are given, how much of that has music as a part of it? How much of it is a drama that we're living out together? How much of what we're doing in unity together as Christians, when we worship God, when we sing, when we bring music before the Lord, there's so much interaction with God that happens through performing arts. And there's so much of it in the Bible. There's so much of it, I think, in our future as Christians. And in this day and age, we do have, I think, a limited understanding of the power of art, because movies have almost separated us a little bit from that personal interaction, where it used to be you would go see people perform because that was the only entertainment around. You didn't have as many options as we do now. We have amazing options, and some of them are beautiful and they're great, but we miss sometimes that personal connection. And when we think about who God is, I mean, we look at the story of creation. I mean, God is a creator. He is an artist. He is the ultimate artist. He is why we care about art. So he's why we care about the beauty of things. And he's instilled that into us. And so if we decide not to take part in that, we're deciding not to take part in part of God's story. Then that doesn't mean that we all need to go be amazing artists, but you don't have to be an amazing artist to sing praise to God. You don't have to be an amazing artist to appreciate the beauty of something that was made by another human or made by God, and just look out at nature and all the beautiful things. Mm-hmm. And so participating in the Christian story is an art. We are all artists in our different ways and in our different spheres. And so as we interact with art in our daily lives, I think it just brings to mind, it reminds us, you think back and the days of the Israelites and the different things that God had them do to remind them, and how much he asked them to remember the things that he has done, the stories that they told each other of the mighty works that God has done. And it's through those stories that they remembered, and they would have monuments to these different miracles and these different things that happened throughout Scripture. And probably because we can take pictures now, we just don't think about creating these same monuments now. We can take pictures and we can, we have information overload all the time. So we're not probably as cognizant of those moments that we need to remember God's story, remember what God has done, remember what God will do, remember what his promises are. And when you have things like stories, and you have things like theater, and you have things like movies, those are monuments in ways that you can personally remember. It's a remembering of, what is the story that I'm a part of? What is the story that God is telling? What is my role in it? Why am I here? And just appreciating that from, as you look, as we are looking at, this Christian worldview, and we're looking at what this full story is, and we're wanting to make sure that we're not limiting God's story. Art plays such a big role in that. And without that, we miss so much beauty. We miss so much of what God has intended us to remember. And so through different ways, so stories are told in many different ways, but if you look at like theater in particular, theater brings you into a story in a way that you just can't be brought in any other way, because you're interacting with people that are so close to you, and you can see them, and you can see the facial expressions, and you can see the way their eyes move and their bodies move and the way they're interacting. And it brings a story to life in a very different way. And so through that medium, you connect with other people, and you connect with other people's stories. I have this strong theory that readers are some of the best empathizers, because you've learned to step into somebody else's story in your head and in your mind. And I think the same thing is true when you interact with somebody on a stage, and you can start to understand other people better. You start to understand yourself better, because all of a sudden you're starting to understand what other people are doing or thinking, or how they're interacting. And through that, you're understanding your place in this story, because we all have a place in it, but we forget that sometimes. One of the, I think, most beautiful passages of the whole Narnia series is in the last battle, when they talk about stories. I'm just going to read it real quick, because it's just, I think it's perfectly encompassing why this matters. And so at the end it says, and for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can mostly truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now at last they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. And that's what stories do, and that's what theater does. It reminds us that we're just in this tiny piece of this great big story. And not only are we in it now, but it's going on for eternity, and we're going to be part of this great big story for the rest of eternity.
I love that, especially because my first role was in a play called We Like Sheep, and they created a special role for me as the silent sheep. That's what my first role was, because I would always talk, and the director was like, okay, here's your role. You're going to step into this role. You're going to be the silent one on the corner. But learning that, I mean, yeah, that's such a beautiful, picture of this is a part. It's the introduction. And there's a beautiful story that this is also, I talk a lot about building muscles and rhythms and habits, and this is building these muscles and these habits and these rhythms of character formation, understanding your role in the story. In this play, you might have a prominent role. In that place, you might have a non-prominent role. But in God's story, there is no, it's the kind of the cheesy line of there are no small parts, just small actors or whatever, right? But there's always that kind of sign of it, but there is that reality too. So this is super helpful. Thanks for explaining a lot of the theater, the behind the scenes part that I have never really thought about and didn't know to me. And this is really great to go upstream in what Max is doing with Fellowship of the Performing Arts. So thanks a lot, Jennifer. Really appreciate your time today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.